Uh, we will today discuss what happens to the question of peace as Europe goes to war. And the occasion for this is first we had Afghanistan, from where United States left because probably it had served their purpose to leave. And then we have Ukraine, where a conflict is going on between Europe, or let's say the so-called democratic Europe, and Russia. So, the interesting part of this conflict that is going on is that we are constantly hearing that this is an occasion when we have to sort of meditate on the question as to whether we will have another world war or not. Yesterday, when Macron won his elections, CNN, person, Christian Amanpour, interviewed a famous philosopher. I'm not going to name names, but he said, this is not merely this is not merely Macron's victory, but Macron here in France has defeated Putin. Someone else said this is a victory for the democratic world. Now, the interesting thing is Europe always assumes it's the world. And the third world, global south, whichever way you want to put it, Africa and Asia, it is always assumed that they're part of Europe, because after all, they're all part of the colonial other of Europe. So in construction of Europe, this particular world is very, very important. So Europe and the United States is constantly invoking democracy and asking this part of the world to take sides. Not so much by Russia, but then if this part doesn't take sides, it probably serves their interest better. Now, we know that over multiple questions on sanctions, on sending this, that, and the other to the war, large groups of the erstwhile non-aligned countries have been silent. So that's why Calcutta Research Group want to ponder over the question of peace. What happens to peace? What happens to the world's workers in this conflict that is going on in Europe right now? Is this conflict really about two worldviews? Is it about democracy or lack of it thereof? Is Ukraine the representative of all the democratic countries? So, what is it that we need to do? Does keeping silent serve the purpose of the workers, migrants, and thousands of people who are sort of, decoupled, as Sandro uses the word, from positions of power? So we have three ace thinkers who have come in today to discuss this pertinent question as to what happens to food security, what happens to security of energy, what happens to nation security, and most importantly, is it necessary to have hierarchical refugee communities for a democracy? Because that's exactly what we are seeing. Some people call it the occasion for rearmament of the world. Some people call it, two different worlds clashing. But what happens to common people like you and me in this sort of a conflict? Are we forced to take sides, or can we remain non-aligned? Our first speaker today is Professor Sandro Misadra, and he is a person. Now, the interesting thing is the three different speakers are from different parts of the world. Marcello Musto, who will be our last speaker, is a professor in York University, Canada. Professor Rona Vishomadar is the Distinguished Professor of Migration and Post-Migration Studies in Calcutta Research Group. He's in Asia. And Sandro is actually from the belly of the beast. He is a professor of political theory in the University of Bologna. He is also attached to the Institute of Culture and Society of Western Sydney University. We have been so familiar with Sandro's work, and he's one of the leading thinkers on globalization and migration and the new political processes. on contemporary capitalism and on political theory and criticism. And there is a huge activist side to Sandro. He is the creator of the web Euronomad. He's also with the post-Barkerist debates. And his publications are renowned by now. Borderless Method, Multiplication of Labor, Politics of Operation, Excavation, Contemporary Capitalism. And with Ronabi Shomadbar and Etienne Balibar, he edited the volume Borders of Justice. He's also the convener of Horizon 2020 program Plus. He's a dear friend of CRG, a dear personal friend. And what people don't know about him is, apart from all of this, he's a fantastic cook. So we are all coming over to Sandro's place. Over to you, Sandro, 25 minutes.
Thank you so much, Paula. It is always amazing to be with you in Calcutta, although unfortunately only on screen. What happens to peace? This is a question that once again we are compelled to ask in times of war. My presentation today will ask a couple of questions about the nature of the present war. I will ask what is at stake in the Ukraine war. And first of all, I think we have to be aware of the fact that we are confronted with a war of aggression. This is something we cannot forget, I think, and it has specific implications for the way in which we struggle against the war. Paula was rightly saying that the Ukraine war is a European war, a war that is fought in the middle of Europe, a war in which the European Union and its member states are deeply involved. But of course, we cannot forget that also the United States is involved. We cannot forget the role played by NATO, both in the set of processes that led to the war and in the current development of the war. It is from this point of view that one of the main question at stake in the current war is the meaning of the West. And I think that we have to ask the question regarding the current meaning of the West, taking seriously the hypothesis that we are confronted with a relative decline of the world hegemony of the United States. This kind of hypothesis that was put forward in the early 1990s by thinkers of the so-called world system theory, like Immanuel Wallerstein and Giovanni Arrighi, has to be, according to me, taken particularly seriously. Today, it builds the kind of blueprint of the current war. I was speaking about the early 1990s. And of course, it was kind of historical conjuncture after the end of the Cold War and the fall of really existing socialism, in which there was a general agreement about the fact that we were facing a new American century. I think this is an important point because also NATO eastward expansion took place in that particular framework. I cannot expand on the history of the last 30 years, of course, but it is quite clear that the substantial defeat of the US in Iraq and in Afghanistan produced a deep change in the general awareness of the way in which global processes were developing. Maybe even more important was the financial crisis of 2007 and 2008 that, as for instance, Adam Tooze has effectively demonstrated, was a factor of acceleration of China's ascent. So these were crucial thresholds that inaugurated a different perception of the position of the US within the global order and disorder, even within the US. And you can easily understand Donald Trump's electoral victory as a kind of attempt to respond to that. In the time of MAGA, of Make America Great Again, there was not much space for the reference to the West. The situation changed with Joe Biden's administration, and over the last 2 years, the West has become again a crucial political concept in the discourse of the US administration. Of course, it is a West that, as it had already happened in the wake of the Second World War, was not geographically defined. One of the main struggles for the definition, the material definition of the West is fought nowadays in the Indo-Pacific. What I find striking and what I would like to discuss with you today is the fact that even in the official political discourse of US administration, the West is today presented as a part of the world. This was not the case in the 1990s. In the 1990s, there was within the establishment, and in particular within the US-American establishment, a kind of expectation that the West could become world, involving both Russia and China. This is not the case anymore today, and this changes the meaning of the West. This changes the meaning of the West, in particular, as far as Europe is concerned. I think that one of the main stakes of the current war in Europe is precisely the relation that Europe takes with respect to the West. And this has also very concrete kind of consequences, in particular regarding the relation between the European Union and NATO. Today, the European Union is in a way led and even overwhelmed by NATO. If you know a bit the history of the European Union over the last 20 years, you will know that there were kind of dramatic geographical fault lines in the material constitution of the European Union. One of them was between North and South, and took dramatic forms in the Greek crisis that culminated in the summer of 2015. But then there was another fault line, another important geographical fault line, which means the fault line between the West and the East. Well, to put it very quickly, there was a dramatic transformation in the last 2 months. Exaggerating a bit, I can say that today, Poland matters more than Germany in the European Union. And Poland is a deeply conservative, nationalist country nowadays, looking at the government, of course, that was criticized by the European Commission for the misrespect of the principle of the rule of law in the last months and years. This kind of criticism disappeared in the wake of the outbreak of the war in Ukraine, because Poland is the frontline country of the European Union in this conjuncture. It is the frontline country of the European Union and of NATO. And let me say that for Poland, as well as for other Eastern European countries, membership of NATO is more important than membership of the European Union. So this is a very weird situation in which the future of Europe is at stake. My own position is that working for peace today in Europe implies working for a kind of decoupling, I use again this word, of the European Union from NATO. I can say more in the discussion, of course, but this is a very important point. What we need is a kind of different relationship also between Europe and the United States of America. Couple of words on a point that I find particularly important which means globalization. As Paula was reminding, I have been working for many years now, in particular with Brett Nielsen on globalization, and we have had a lot of discussions with Paula, with Rana Beer and other friends at CRG. In a way, I have been criticizing the rhetoric of globalization, and I have tried to shed light on the materiality of global processes that constitute, in a way, the fabric of capitalism today. Well, as you know, already in the first 2 years of the pandemic, there were many voices advocating the end of globalization. And the Ukraine war has added more voices to that. I think this is a point we have to critically discuss. I don't have the time now to expand on that, but maybe later we'll have a chance to discuss. What I find striking is the fact that both in Russia and in the US, there is a growing consensus on the fact that globalization is over and the global culture wars have begun. This is the title of an article that came out last week in the New York Times, an article by David Brooks, a respected liberal commentator. In Russia, you can find similar tones. And this is a second point I would like to stress for our discussion today. Are we confronted with a global situation that looks very much like the one envisaged or proposed by Samuel Huntington in his famous 1996 book, Clash of Civilizations? I don't think that was a kind of analytic book. It was a political program. And we have to struggle against the instantiations of clash of civilizations that abound nowadays in and around what is happening in Ukraine. To struggle for peace today is to struggle against this civilizational discourse of clashes and wars among cultures. To conclude, I think that today more than ever in the last years, we need to work toward a new internationalism. A new internationalism is urgently needed, but we have to construct it, because there are groups everywhere in the world that define themselves as internationalists, and this is good, but it is not enough. We need a new discourse or new discourses of internationalism, and in particular, we need to experiment with political internationalist organizations beyond the scale of the nation states that was the constitutive scale for historical experiences of socialist and communist internationalism. We know there was a conference in Zimmerwald more than 100 years ago during the Great War. And that was a great moment in the history of internationalism. Many of us have foreshadowed a new Zimmerwald. And I think this is the right direction, but we have to be aware of the difficulties of such a task. We don't have the organizations that were able to organize the Zimmerwald conference. In a way, we need to invent such new internationalist organizations in the same process in which we work toward a new Zimmerwald. So to conclude, this is for me a third way to tackle the question about peace today. I was speaking at the beginning of the spaces of peace, particularly referring to Europe. I was speaking of the need to struggle against culture wars. And now I say a new internationalism. There is no real peace without a new internationalism. But a new internationalism must have an immediate task, must be able to open up spaces in which we construct a mobilization capable to stop the present war. If we don't stop the present war, I think we will live through difficult times in the next months and years. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sandro. So after redefining the West, Sandro talked about, Professor Bezadra talked about the cultural wars and the struggle between the US and Russia. And then he made an urgent call for a new international, on the lines of Zimmerman, for the peace question. Most importantly, I think it was a clarion call for this particular war to end, because without this war ending, this might go into or spill off into places where it's urgently not wanted. After all, we know that Marx talked about war as always a civil war for workers. Now I will request Professor Ronobi Shomadar, who is the Distinguished Professor of Migration and Post-Migration Studies in the Calcutta Research Group, to say his ideas on this peace question. Professor Shomadar is well known to most of our viewers today. However, I will say a few words about him. He is considered as one of the legal thinkers from the School of Critical Studies, and apart from migration and post-migration, he works on governance, on post-colonial state, on questions of restructuring and technologies for the control of labor, the labor question, and also the control of migrants. Just like Sandro Bezadra, Professor Ronobi Shomadar also has a tremendously vibrant activist side to his, and he has millions of publications. I'm not going to go through all of them now, but his recent work, The Post-Colonial Age of Migration, and his book on pandemic and life are really pathbreakers. And I'm going to mention one book, particularly because I am involved in that one too, and that is, his book on migrant workers and COVID-19 that came out from Social Science Press, and it is being published by Routledge. So we request you to buy that book, India's Migrant Worker and the Pandemic. So over to you, Professor Shomadar, for your views. 25 minutes max.
Thank you. I'm really happy and excited to be a part of this discussion, partly because it also brings back CRG's once upon a time, a pioneering role in advancing peace politics and peace studies in South Asia. Old members of CRG would remember, and even now, I think somewhere on the CRG website, it is written how CRG was born. So it acted as the secretarial group for the Pakistan-India People's Forum for Peace and Democracy. For the first 5 years, it conducted peace dialogues between different social groups on the conflict questions in the northeast of the country, and it worked for another 10 years, maybe on displacements due to war and conflict. Not only civil war in India, meaning war between the government of the state and some sections of population, but also war between India and Pakistan, warlike condition, and what happens to the common people. So that CRG has decided to engage once again on the peace question is heartening, and I think it is also redeeming in many ways. So I therefore speak of the peace question primarily as a peace activist. I agree with most of what my dear friend Sandro has mentioned. 2-3 things I am very happy that he has mentioned: the international dimension, the question of what is Europe. And these were the things that I thought I would explain at length, but since Sandro has already referred to that, I will just mention them when the time comes. Now, as a peace researcher or as a peace activist, we must begin with the fact that the just war theory doesn't apply here. For a group or for a political force that wants to work on peace, in this context, there is no ground to accept the just war theory formulations. If you do so, or if we do so, then the ground and the scope to frame peace politics will become very narrow to the point of being impossible. I will explain that later, but I think this is important. This is not to say that wars cannot be just, but certainly we have to understand that the neoliberal time has effected a great change in the patterns of global conflicts. In Rwanda, there was no just war by any side. I can mention several wars, and not only internal conflicts, but let's say the internecine war that led to the dissolution of Yugoslavia. There was no just war. So first thing, and I know this is a controversial point, but first thing first, that we have to discard the just war theory. And shockingly many, how would I put it, left liberals and confirmed leftist thinkers have picked up the just war theory in order to jump into the Ukrainian conflict. They sacrificed the banner of peace. They forgot their duties, and their basic plank was just war. One of the reasons, I will mention very few, one of the reasons is that if you look at humanitarianism, this is a glass that is showing cracks from side to side. Paula mentioned in the beginning the humanitarian question, how it is being weaponized. Indeed, humanitarianism by itself has been weaponized. And as part of that, the refugee question has been weaponized. The sanctions are the weaponization of global economy. And on top of that, again, something I hope that there is discussion, and I know that this is a very controversial thing, but with friends in the discussion, this is the time to air our views and discuss. Also, there is a blatant display of something that was long in the tradition of war, which is the tradition of creating human shields. One of the things that I want to relate on this is that on one hand, there is a general principle of peace, and the left has to work for peace. But at the same time, this general principle is not enough unless we come to grips with the particular situation, analysis of the particular context, and devise what can be the peace strategy, how to articulate the question of peace. Now, if you think of humanitarianism, and if we want to call to public notice the way humanitarianism has been weaponized in this war, I can give you the example of human shield. Now, this phrase human shield actually emerged only following the Second World War, even though the practice of human shielding has been common for a very long time. I mean, take, for example, 7th century. Chinese and quote-unquote barbarian tribes on the Turco-Mongol frontier as human buffers, while Mongols deployed prisoners as shields during their conquest. In the 11th century, crusaders were advised to set their Muslim captives out naked in chains to take the force of enemy missiles. And throughout the Middle Ages, hostages were used as human shields in different battles and conflicts. There are, of course, willing human shields also. We know the very famous example, and someone whose name should be written in golden letters in all peace activist chambers, you know, Rachel Corrie, you remember, who wanted to shield the Palestinian victims as their houses were being bulldozed by the occupation regime and died. But mostly, human shields are involuntary. People who are forced to serve as buffer, and a careful record of historical, careful reading of historical records would reveal that their use has not been uncommon. But we forgot that most of the time, who can become a refugee and who cannot become a refugee? Who is allowed to leave the country? Who will be disallowed from leaving the country? These are all political decisions, and these decisions are essentially coercive in nature. The history of human shielding touches, in fact, therefore, several nerves. And if you see the weaponization of the whole refugee regime, again, there is no time to go into that. You will notice that this history tells us who deserves to be treated humanly at a given historical moment and who does not. And therefore, as we know, this history illustrates how racial, class, religious, sexual, gender orders, they all help and shape our understanding of the human, and therefore the ethics of violence and legal frameworks. This is very important because the peace activists would have to confront, quote unquote, the humanitarian. I am not saying that they will drop the flag of humanitarianism, but I think the time has come to engage with the certain crucial aspects of the present war squarely, with new formulations, with taking the neoliberal context into account, that will show us that while there are continuities to the liberal way of waging war, but in the neoliberal time, there are discontinuities also. Which also means that Sandro was mentioning the clash of civilization. Now, democracy has become, for good or bad, a culture word. It is part of a civilization. While authoritarianism is again a culture word, it forms a part of culture war, and it is part of the enemy of liberal civilization. So the liberal international order is a very accepted phrase, yet, as some scholars are pointing out, that there is a great delusion. Now, whether it is a delusion, whether liberal dreams are confronting the international realities, I wouldn't put it like that. But all I can say is that while some of the peace activists would say that we don't have to think of the context, but no peace question can be articulated, no peace politics can be framed without taking the context into account. And if you see, after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, it was widely believed and anticipated that the West, which would mean, and Sandro is right, that without the United States, you cannot think of West or Europe, but that would call into discussion the whole question of NATO that has framed Europe. I do not think that at any point of time, except in certain economic sphere, the Europe was ever, apart from what can be called the Atlantic community. So they thought that after this dissolution of the USSR, they would be able to consign, let us say, the illiberal orders across the globe to, someone mentioned the question of a clash of civilization. So let us say to the dustbin of history. There will be a push for open economies. There will be a push for all-embracing institutions. And under that cover, but it is not new, in as much as, colonialism or liberal ideas followed the flag of trade in the colonial time, it's the same thing that under the garb of democracy and economic and support for liberalism, you have once again a new flag of war, being posted and flagged. So the transmutation from a bipolar alignment to the idea that this bipolar alignment is over and now democracy can safeguard human rights, advocate global peace, ratify democratic establishments, it has to be subjected to fundamental critique. And the indiscriminate way we have adopted this word democracy, turning it from a political thing to a cultural thing, has destroyed or has destroyed to a great extent the chances of peace politics. So therefore, peace politics has to understand what are the adversity. If you think of the weaponization of economy, and Sandro was referring to other tools, besides tools, others are also, explaining this, but clearly trade and finance, they are intimately associated, and the disruption in one is mirrored in the shock to the other. We are living through that reality. Now, whether these shocks are truly systemic or not, we don't know. But on the other hand, it is true that the overall financial system will no doubt be affected in an unforeseen way. And global trade will become multipolar. I mean, the transition in any case would have come, if you ask me, but it would have been less anarchic, but then war always invites great changes. We always try to disband war from our thinking. But the unfortunate thing is that all peace activists must contend with war, must think of war when they frame their politics, peace politics. You cannot think of peace without thinking of war and the context of war and what war will be bringing about. It was true of the post-Second World War situation. It was only with the Second World War that you could have the Geneva Conventions, that you could have a basis of a new legal order, you could have the Bretton Woods system, you could have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and then one can go on, and you could not have the great decolonization revolutions in Africa, Asia, and certainly parts of Latin America. So the concrete question of war has to be understood, and how war, finance has become a part of war. I mean, we can think of harsh sanctions that the US imposed on Venezuela, Iran, and North Korea. Yes, they have weakened these economies, but can we say that because of sanctions, they have changed politics or policies of these countries in the way the US government or Europe have sought? No. Sanctions, again, they are easy to evade, at least in part, and more evasions emerging over time will lead to more anarchy. We can think of, rising number of transactions with Russia in rubles, Indians in rupees, the Chinese in renminbi, or other non-dollar currencies. And clearly, we have here in spite of all the sanctions and all the things, we think that, and this is where I shall say that possibly this is the euro-dollar axis and the euro-dollar link is possibly the last frontier in terms of Western dominance. It is the last frontier that will probably be vanquished. And what the result will be, we do not know, because this is unlike Second World War. As I'm saying that in case of Second World War or pre-Second World War time, you had a floating, basket, but you have also pound, even though the pound didn't dominate in the way today, dollar dominates. But this is something. All these leads me to my last but one point, that this war, because it's being conducted in the neoliberal time, you may say that there is one of the obstacles that peace activists would have to confront is the whole question of what is normally called the fog of war. Peace activists for years, whether from Mali to Afghanistan or from erstwhile Yugoslavia to Libya, Iraq, Palestine, peace activists, they have risked their lives for that. So it's not a question of justifying war. But on the other hand, we need to confront the fog of war because we must understand what led us to this situation. So we have to examine the roots of the Ukrainian conflict. We cannot avoid this task. It may start with those who thought that during the Maidan uprising in 2013 and then 14 and all that, this was a great road to democratization. We have to find out how many left really called out the sham. We may say that Ukraine was fighting separatists or independentists in the Donbas region. There will be other versions, but I do not think that the whole question of referendum, the way media has covered it, whether it was a referendum for independence, but all they have asked for autonomy, all these things we have to, ask ourselves very clearly. And we have to, as I say, that we have to fight the fog of war. And we cannot take, shelter behind the fact that, oh, all parties are now conducting the media war. This is a lame excuse. This is, I think, a lazy way of doing peace research or peace activism. I think what constitutes the fog of war, how it is contributing to war, is very important, and avoiding it, evading it, I do not think that we can come squarely to the whole task of how do we articulate peace, what will be the main principles. The final question, is there any middle ground? And and that is where I think I again appreciate Sandro's point, that why it is, Sandro was mentioning Poland, Ukraine, and I am reminded of Balibar, my elderly, in many ways I have learned from him. And I reread his piece, very famous lecture, The Borders of Europe. And I remember, I think Paula was present. I have my memory may be weak. Probably Sandro was present, but I do not know. But in a seminar in Paris, I asked him that this great article, great lecture, in Greece, you speak of the borders of Europe on the east. What about the west? Where does the European border? I still remember that he thought that I was, unnecessarily provoking, a question. But I thought at that time this was important. I thought that he was looking at the border question as a Europeanist. But if you really have to look at the border, you have to look at it, quote and unquote, from the outside to see where the borders. If you read of these famous histories of Atlantic trade and the export of slaves or human labor in the 17th century, I have been mentioning that Shakespeare was one of the shareholders of the first company, chartered company, that transported human beings for labor in supposedly to New England, but it crashed and landed in Jamaica. So the frontier has already been the Atlantic, and the border was there. And today, the new borderland Ukraine, Poland. These are the new borderlands. And what is interesting for those who do border politics is that this borderland, which was thought to be a very harmless concept, or a concept for human rights activists, those who want to avoid the harshness of the concept of border, and they tried to take shelter behind the concept of borderlands where people come and go. There will be, maybe illegal, but necessary traffic of commodities, ideas, intermingling it, that all very good things. But they all forgot that borderland is first the land where the militarization would begin, and then the border would be militarized. So the whole American strategy, for that matter, the NATO strategy of actually arming Georgia today, expanding, why it is expanding on the West? Why does it doesn't want to expand on the South, let us say, across the Mediterranean? There, the NATO will only conduct operations. It will conduct operations in former Yugoslavia. It conducted operation in Afghanistan. It will conducted operation in Libya, but no question of taking them in the NATO. But why it is that Poland, Ukraine, Finland, everyone has to fall in line or is tempted to fall in line, because this is the borderland where, bypassing the classic liberal Western Europe, today neoliberalism can militarize and go on further conquest. Therefore, the borders of Europe would have to be thought of in a new way, from the angle of the active peace activists, and not from the angle of quote and unquote human rights and democracy. Because what is a frontline country is being determined again in, if I use Sandro's word, materially, which means that materiality is constituted by clash of arms, clash of economy, clash of politics, clash of social forces, and peace politics is extremely contentious. So is there therefore, given this reality, the right to remain neutral? It is not only a question of the global South remaining neutral. I don't think it's a question of only the non-Europeans remaining neutral, even though beyond the metaphorical thing, there is some element of reality in that. But the right to reclaim neutrality and the right to the heritage of non-alignment that the massive Afro-Asian world, those who got decolonized, when they claimed, we have to understand, and I am just recalling Sekuturi, Kenyatta, these are very famous declarations in the UN in 50s, in 60s, in 70s, why they want to remain neutral. Why it is that they say that to ask for peace, to work for peace, the first thing in such kind of conflicts is to remain neutral. So I think one of the questions that we have to, and I shall stop here, that we have to think of is the historical basis of the right to be neutral. And on the other hand, on that historical basis, claim this right in today's context. That will lead us to something that CRG had practiced. Unfortunately, CRG in the last 10 years had forgotten, or we became oblivious, or we didn't give enough importance to the peace question in our work on migrants, refugees, friendships and histories of enmity, etc., is the whole question of what is then a peace process and how do we conduct peace audit? How do you audit the peacemaking capacity of a society? What are the forces of peace? And I'm so happy that Sandro raised the question of Zimmerwald. Now, Zimmerwald is something that has been made immortal, not only in the history of the socialist, internationalist, communist thought, but you see if in the writings of not Rosa, but Lenin, who was in a minority, the Bolsheviks and other left-wing socialists of that time, who made Zimmerwald the remarkable conference of the political activists of that time. They have given us the blueprint of how to work for peace.
Ranubika, if you can sum up in 1 minute.
Yes, in 1 minute. And therefore, if you speak of Zimmerwald and think of Lenin, I remember I was having a conversation with Sandro when I was in Europe a month or 2 months ago, that Lenin, who made, in a way, Zimmerwald also reshaped or shaped Lenin's politics further. Lenin said that if you have to work for peace, the peace question, you have to bend the reality towards peace. The reality is given, but that reality appears to many people in as many ways as possible. How do we bend the reality to what we work for? How do we assess the peacemaking capacities of society? How do we facilitate forces that will be working for peace? That is, I think, what, to recall Lenin's this very famous phrase, that we have to bend the reality to the cause of peace and to the cause of socialism. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ronobida. Ronobida begins by invoking the legacy of working on peace in Calcutta Research Group and brings it to the question of peace. And he says that there are just wars, which itself is a critical notion. And I think a lot of what he says will evoke a lot of questions and debate. He comes to his conclusion that he sides with Sandro, that, in talking about how we can sort of think of a worldview and peace from a different perspective right now. And he asks that to understand the question of peace, we have to understand the roots of war. And then he says, is there a middle ground? And makes a stinging sort of criticism of that particular middle ground. In the process, he also criticizes CRT. So we will have to, contend with what Professor Shomadar seeks. I myself want to jump into the debate right now, but I will hold myself back because we have another ace speaker, and that is Marcello Musto. Marcello Musto is a professor of sociology at York University, and he's made significant contribution for revival of Marx studies in the last 2 decades, I would say. In fact, a dear friend of mine who is extremely Marxist said that he is the presiding deity of Marx studies now. So we are looking forward to listening from him. His books that I have read is Another Marx, Early Manuscripts to the International in 2018, and then last year's of Karl Marx and Intellectual Biography. And, one has to mention some of his edited works, which are extremely influential for our thinking on Marxism today. Karl Marx Grundriss. I think that's an excellent volume. And then Workers Unite. I'm missing a lot of his very important contribution because I can go on and on. He is the editor for Palgrave's, the collection on Marx, Engels, and Marxism. And he is also the series editor for a number of other publication houses. We're all excited that we already had 2 very excellent speakers, Sandro Mezzadra and Ronovi Shomadar. Now let us listen to Marcello Musto. So Marcello, you have 25 minutes.
Good evening to everybody, and Paula, many thanks for this very generous, perhaps too generous introduction. It's a pleasure for me to discuss with Ranabir, with Sandro, to return to you. I was already in Kolkata a few years ago, even though online. And I want to clarify I will say the scope, the boundaries of my presentation today. I was asked by Ranabir Samadar to give a presentation, perhaps also in order to avoid repetitions, around the topic war and the left in the last 150 years. So what is the history? What is the relationship that the left had, the conflictual relation sometimes that the left had with regard to the big question of war? And I hope that you will see that during my presentation, during which I will have 2 risks, one to be superficial, the other one perhaps to read too many quotations, but I will try to do this in order to be as precise as possible. You will see during this short presentation that some of the topic that Sandro Mezzadra and Ranabir Shomadar mentioned, for example, the question of a war of aggression, or the question of a just war mentioned by Ranabir, war of defense, for example, these are just things that happen already in the past to labor movement. And what we want to do is learn from the experience of the past. So first of all, what is the main characteristic of the labor movement with respect to understanding wars? I will say that it's the nexus between the development of capitalism and the spread of wars. Because from the very beginning, from the first international, war was no longer explained like the science of politics with ideological, political, or sometimes even psychological motivations and category, but particularly with relation to economic categories. So for example, we know that wars are inevitable under the capitalist production. And if we go back, as I said, to the debate of the First International, already in 1868, there is this idea that wars cannot be explained with the ambitions of monarchs or other individuals, but they must be understood in relation to the dominant social economic model. Close to this, there is another important point for us, that is the idea that the labor movement is fighting for the final abolition of all wars, and that, very important for me, all wars should be considered like civil wars. There is no difference if a war is done between workers of different countries or of different cities within the same country. Wars must be abolished. Karl Marx never produced, I would say, a non-contradictory or a non-fragmentary analysis of war. We know that his constant view was the opposition to Tsarist Russia at the time. It was, on the contrary, Engels who wrote about war a lot, particularly at the end of his life. And perhaps very few people know that Engels wrote a series of articles in 1843, and they were published together under the title, Can Europe Disarm? And in these articles, Engels is talking about the unprecedented level of arms production and the risk that this will mean, because for Engels, this is the real danger of creating a war of destruction like the world has never seen. This is 1893, imagine now. What happens from the 1870s, but particularly at the end of the 19th century, is the confrontation, is the fact that I would say labor movement is no longer confronting with war just as a theoretical debate in peacetime, but now is dealing with this as the foremost political issue of the age, of the time. This is already starting in 1870, just before the Paris Commune, at the time of the Franco-Prussian conflict, when, for example, the members of parliament, the few members of parliament of the German social democracy, Bebel, Liebknecht, they voted against, they reject the bills for additional funding to continue the war. They went to jail, they were sent to jail, but they show an alternative way to act in front of wars. And this was also important at the beginning, at the foundation of the Second International in 1889, when at the founding Congress of this organization, it was written in the document, in the final document, that peace was an indispensable precondition of any emancipation of the workers. So for a growing part of the labor movement, I would say war is no longer seen as it was before, perhaps starting from the French Revolution, perhaps starting from 1792 Revolutionary War. There is all this idea that Girondins considered these wars as a crusade for liberty, like the most glorious form of the working class to fight against oppressor and to export the revolution outside France. Note that Robespierre is against this, and Robespierre wrote, liberty is not brought at the point of bayonets. But I will say that this ideology is now challenged, right? And war is no longer seen as opening up revolutionary opportunity and hastening the breakdown of the system. Not entirely, at least. In the very important Stuttgart Congress of 1907, there was a resolution called On Militarism and International Conflict, and mostly there were 3 points that were accepted by all the delegates of the conference. A vote against budget that increased military spending, the fact that there is an antipathy, I would say, towards standing army and a preference for a system of people's militia. And then, of course, this idea that is coming from the bourgeois side, the support for the plan to create courts of arbitration to settle international conflicts peacefully, right? Later, there will be more debates. I don't have time to talk about this, but I just want to say that everybody is voting in favor of this, including in favor of amendments that were prepared by Luxembourg and Lenin, because this was not going to force political parties in their countries, for example, the SPD in Germany, to make any change to their political lines. This document, this resolution was the last documents who was voted unanimously at the Second International. And I would say that after this time, there is always less and less involvement from the Second International in order to create a policy of action in favor of peace, right? So, and we know how this story ended. The Second International proved to be completely impotent in the face of war, and failed the main objective that was the preservation of peace. In this period, and I'm of course talking about the Great War, World War I, there is a growing, in the minority of course, but there is a new movement against war. I'm talking about Zimmerwald Congress, Quintal Congress, 1915-16, and then of course the two major thinkers, Rosa Luxemburg and Vladimir Lenin. Luxemburg was particularly brilliant. We know her because she said that war on war, this slogan should become the cornerstone of the working class politics. And she also argued that the main goals of the proletariat should be fighting imperialism and preventing wars in peace as in war times, also in peacetime. And Engels wrote an interesting piece, Socialism and War, 1915, where Engels is going against Lenin, it's going against the historical falsification that the bourgeoisie tried to demonstrate at the time about what were called progressive national liberation wars, wars of progressive liberation. For Lenin, this is not true. And these were just wars of plunder, he wrote, wars in which belligerents were this time to oppress the most foreign peoples and to increase the inequality of capitalism. So it was just about which side of the belligerent were going to oppress more the foreign people. Lenin is also going against the social chauvinists, this is the category with this terminology of the time, because he said that beyond the claim to defend the fatherland, there is actually this idea that great powers had the right to pillage the colonies and oppress foreign people. So the offensive of just wars were for Lenin possible and doable, but not in the sense of thinkers like Jean Jaurès, like European powers defending from all the European powers, but in the sense of going against imperial powers. And this is also the time where Lenin, in this text, is creating this very famous slogan, turn imperialistic war into civil war. In any case, I also wanted to mention that war, this topic, is also creating debate, dramatic debates, and also big splits, huge splits, also in other camps, not only in the social democracy or in Marxist tradition. This is also the case of anarchism, for example. Kropotkin, the most famous anarchist when he was alive at the end of his life, I'm talking about during World War I, he was against Germany because he was afraid that if Germany would win the war, this will decrease the level of emancipation in Europe. So he wrote that the task of any person holding dear the idea of human progress is to squash the German invasion in Western Europe. You will see that in my quotation, there is the attempt to show you similarities with today, because we are not for the first time approaching these issues. So we are asking the same question with Russia today that perhaps Kropotkin was considering at the time in relation to, Germany, and in relation to the aggressive politics of German Weltpolitik. But Enrico Malatesta, and with Malatesta, the majority of the anarchists of the time, they argued that for the general good against the common enemy of democracy, a struggle like this is something that will bring working classes to subjugation of ruling classes. Like what Malatesta is trying to say is that a German victory will certainly spell the triumph of militarism. I'm reading from this anti-war international manifesto of 1915, but also the triumph for the Allies will mean Russian, British domination in Europe and Asia. So there is a no to Germany, but also no to Russian, British alliance. And this is similar to what we are trying to do today. None of the belligerents has any rights to claim the flag of civilization, is writing manifesto, Malatesta in this manifesto. The same debate, the same split, similar at least, happened in the feminist movement. Because at the time where women were replacing conscripted men in jobs, right, men who were sent to war, they were able to understand, at least with the help of communist women leaders like Clara Zetkin, Rosa Luxemburg, Kollontai, Pankhurst, they were able to understand that in evoking the enemy at the gates, and this was the propaganda was doing at the time, war was used to roll back fundamental social reforms. And also the struggle against militarism was understood as an essential element of the struggle against patriarchy. It is very complicated for me now in the few minutes that I have to summarize the debate that happened in the 1920s, 1930s. I just want to mention that there is this idea that the new 1914, a new war is inevitable. So in the labor movement, the talk was more and the debate was more of what to do if a new war broke out than how to prevent from a new war to start. At least, the real debate, not the position that were sometimes appearing in articles at the time. And there is also a language of war that is still very strong, although, Europe is destroyed after the Great War. Take, for example, the terminology used by Mao Zedong in 1930s, this omnipotence of revolutionary war. I'm reading for Problems of War and Strategy, 1938. The sides of power by armed force, the settlement of the issue by war is the central task of the highest form of revolution. This ideology is reinforcing itself within actually existing socialism, with the Great Patriotic War that started in 1941 in response to the attack made by Hitler to Soviet Union, and later the division of the world in two blocks. This ideology is becoming prominent in Soviet Union. And there is a big difference with the initial position that I mentioned at the beginning of my talk. This is also true at the time of the peaceful coexistence, right? The attempt from Khrushchev to start a new political course of Soviet Union. This is happening internationally, perhaps, but within the so-called socialist camp, this is not the case. In 1956, before peaceful coexistence, Soviet Union already invaded Hungary, and in 1968, as it is well known, there is the same with Czechoslovakia. Brezhnev mentioned in a very famous speech at the Congress of the Polish United Workers' Party in 1968, I'm reading the topic, the concept of limited sovereignty. So Brezhnev said, when forces that are hostile to socialism try to turn the development of some socialist country toward capitalism, it becomes not only a problem of the country concerned, but a common problem and concern of all socialist countries. Of course, According to this anti-democratic logic, the definition of what is socialist and what is not socialist fell to the arbitrary decision of the Soviet leaders. But what I'm trying to say is that the negative role of Soviet Union is increasing more and more, and there is a different message from the position of labor movement. I can make other examples. Perhaps the most famous one is Afghanistan in 1979. And there are also the so-called socialist wars, right? The war between Cambodia and Vietnam, or China and Vietnam at the time of the Sino-Soviet conflict, that dissipated, in my opinion, the last or whatever leverage remain of this so-called Marxist ideology, already remote from the original foundation laid by Marx and Engels, that war are exclusively the cause of capitalism, right? Here there is a so-called socialist wars between socialist countries. There were no changes after 1989, as we know. The end of Cold War did not lessen the amount of interference in other country affairs, nor did it increase the freedom of every people to choose the political regime under which to live. And in the last 5 minutes, I will try to speak about today, but always with this historical approach that I try to add so far, because the Russian-Ukrainian war has again faced the left with the question of what to do, the dilemma of what to do when a country's sovereignty is under attack, as has been said also during the first two contributions to our debate. And I will quickly overview three different positions. The first position is the position of those who fail to condemn a Russia invasion of Ukraine clearly, strongly. I can make the example of the government of Venezuela, for example. And in my opinion, this makes future denunciation of possible future war, possible future act of aggression committed by United States, for example, they will appear less credible. And also, I think that the left should have learned from the 20th century that the alliance with my enemy's enemy, they were often counterproductive, particularly where the left is weak and when there are very weak social movements against war or for emancipation. I would like to recall a quotation from Lenin from the text, The Social Revolution and the Rights the Nations to Self-Determination, because left has historically supported the principle of national self-determination. And Lenin is writing, the fact that the struggle for national liberation against one imperialist power may, under certain circumstances, be utilized by another great power in its equally imperialist interests should have no more weight in inducing social democracy to renounce its recognition of the right of nation to self-determination. And actually, there is a juicy quotation that Lenin is doing the year after in the result of the discussion on self-determination, where he wrote, if the socialist revolution were to be victorious in Petrograd, Berlin, and Warsaw, the Polish socialist government, like the Russian and the German socialist government, will renounce the forcible retentions of Ukrainians with the frontiers of the Polish state. So why should we accept anything different? And this to be conceded to the nationalist government led by Vladimir Putin. But at the same time, I also want to strongly criticize the other position, the position of the left, who has the temptation, who has ceded to the temptation to become directly or indirectly co-belligerents, right? This left that is fueling this new union sacrée, this left that we saw clapping Zelensky in the parliaments of different countries where the president of Ukrainian were giving speeches asking for, more troops and, ammunitions, etc. I want to say that history shows that when the left is not opposing war and is progressive forces lose an essential part of their reason for existence and end up being very similar to the right, to the ideology of the opposite camp, the camp that they should fight. There are many examples also in the last few years, like the Italian communists supporting the war in Kosovo, in Afghanistan, or today a significant part of Unidas Podemos in Spain, or also the Finnish left at the government today, and they're opening to NATO, many of them, at least too many of them. I would like to end with a couple of quotations from Marx from the 1850s. They contain, in my opinion, interesting and useful parallels with the present day. In 1857, in a short piece that seems to be written for Putin, Marx wrote, "One merely needs to replace one series of names and dates with others, and it becomes clear that the policies of Ivan III and those of Russia today are not merely similar, but identical." Ivan III is the Tsar that laid the ground for autocracy in Russia. And at the same time, in an article written for the New York Tribune, Marx wrote, "It is a mistake to describe the war against Russia as a war between liberty and despotism." Marx is fighting the liberal Democrats who exalted the anti-Russian coalition, because for Marx, Bonaparte would be then the representative of democracy, and the whole object of the war would be the maintenance of Vienna Agreement, those agreements which annul the liberty of independence of nations. So in my opinion, if we replace Bonaparte with United States of America, and we replace the Vienna Agreement with NATO, this observation seems as if they were written for us today. So the position, our position, the last one, the third one, is those who think to oppose both Russian and Ukrainian nationalism, as well as the expansion of NATO, the position of non-alignment. Those who propose a policy of non-alignment, in my opinion, this would be the most effective, or we should say, would have been the most effective way of ending war as soon as possible, and also ensuring the smallest numbers of victims. There is the problem about NATO, because now it is, of course, there is a growing consensus. I make the case of Finland, there is also the case of Sweden. So we should do as much as we can to demonstrate that NATO is the largest and the most aggressive war machine in the world, dangerous and an ineffectual organization that actually fuel tensions leading to war in the war. And I will also say, and this is my final point, that the left should return to this idea indicated by Lenin, the idea that there are progressive wars. I believe that Lenin is saying, you know, Marxists are not pacifists or anarchists, and they are not against all war. They deem it necessary historically to study each war separately. I believe that it would be a mistake, a short-sighted, to simply repeat this in contemporary societies. Contemporary society with weapons of mass destruction continually spreading. I'm done, Paula, just one final minute. So rarely wars had the democratizing effect that the theorists of socialism hope for. They have often proved to be the worst way of carrying out a revolution, and war disseminate an ideology of violence, of nationalist sentiment that have turned the workers' movement apart, and rarely have favored practice of self-management and direct democracy. They actually increase the power of authoritarian institutions. So in my opinion, for the left, we cannot say that war is the continuation of politics by other means. In reality, war certifies the failure of politics. And if the left wishes to become hegemonic again, the left needs to write indelibly on its banners once again the words anti-militarism and not to war. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Marcello Musto. This has been an excellent presentation. Professor Musto also brings in a stinging critique of the left movements. And I think I'm here with you when you talk about the feminist movement. We've seen how feminist cause have been always subsumed within the cause for war. You know, war is often fought in the names of women. War is often fought in the names of mothers. And we have a number of questions on that as well. I'm not going to take time away from the speakers and the people who've asked their questions, because I think already in the chat, we have a brewing debate, and I'm all for it. I will pose the questions that are there to each speaker to ponder for a minute or two, and then come in whenever they feel like it. Sandro Mizadra, the questions that you have, can all the speakers switch on their cameras, please? Speakers, please switch on your cameras. Sandro, Ranavir, and Marcello, please switch on your cameras. So the first question to Sandro Mizadra is, in your view, would you say that globalization is in a way an expansion of capitalism globally? And there's another question by the same person, and that is, I agree with the new need for new internationalism or international order, as the old order is inconsistent with the rapidly changing developments. Would the new international order be cognizant of the multiple powers that are emerging and the resistance of the mega powers to accept this possibility? The next questions are to Professor Shomadar, and these questions are, there's another question for Professor Mezadra. In this discussion for a new international, how can decolonization come in? I ask this because the world is super saturated with accepting Western civilization. Professor Shomadar has a lot of questions from John Dunn, who asks, how do the panelists suggest that it's possible to stop the present war without either ensuring the military defeat of Russia or the destruction of Ukraine as a space in which its current citizens can live on terms which they can decide for themselves in a country which has not been largely destroyed as a built environment and a reliable supply of food for a large part of the world? His second question is, I would especially like to ask Ranavir whether peace activists have any specific responsibility to try to stop the rape of mothers, and here we come to that, for hours in front of their children before they're killed in front of the children, and cities of a country are smashed to pieces. Is speaker activism completely time insensitive when it comes to the continuing destruction of a country, whether that be Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Ukraine, or Libya? His third question is, do the panelists believe that because the just war theory does not apply to most, if any, wars of the last few decades, it is no longer possible to recognize a naked war of aggression, and no such war can leave room for a just peace if those terms are set by the aggressor at the expense of those who've been attacked? To Marcello Musto, we have the questions that they say who comes with equity must come with clean hands. Countries in Africa are not openly condemning the war in Ukraine, not because NATO and USA have lost legitimacy by creating chaos in Libya, Iraq, and Afghanistan. And the third question from John Dunn is also to you, Professor Musto. Do the panelists believe that because the just war theory does not apply to most, if any, wars of the last few decades, it is no longer possible to recognize a naked war of aggression, and no such war can leave room for a just peace if these terms are set by the aggressor? So over to three of you. Please raise your hand whenever you want to respond to the questions. And of course, anyone can pick up any question, whether it's asked to you or not, because I think the questions are related and the topics that you spoke on were related. So we are not asking you to respond to any particular question. You, all three of you, are thinkers who've listened to the entire workshop. So we want you to come up and tell us your responses. Can we start with Sandro in that order?
Sure. Great questions and great presentations by Ranabir and by Marcello. I think we could discuss for hours, which means that we need other occasions to develop our debate. Let me just mention one topic that did not really come up in the discussion. I quickly touched upon it. It's the position of China. I think it's a very important question. It's a very important question also with respect to South Asia, with respect to what is happening these days in Sri Lanka, for instance. I think that the war in Ukraine is also shaping the situation in Sri Lanka, and we must be aware of that. We must be aware of the global implications of the war, to put it very quickly. So the question regarding globalization, of course, globalization has to be understood as a process or a set of processes that facilitate the expansion of capitalism. I think, nevertheless, there is an important point to be made here, which means that capitalism is everywhere. We are not confronted with a situation like the one famously described by Rosa Luxemburg in 1913. There is no outside to capitalism nowadays. So globalization reshapes, reorganizes capitalism. And in a way, the same is true with respect to neoliberalism. Also, neoliberalism is everywhere, although we have understood in recent years that neoliberalism takes very different forms. We have to speak of a variegated neoliberalism. Just to think of Russia. Russia is a completely neoliberalized country. Although it's clear that neoliberalism in Russia is shaping the society, but has a different kind of relationship with political power and with capitalism writ large. This is another point we had not the time to discuss thoroughly. The question is for me, what is capitalism in Russia? Which is the peculiarity of the capitalist formation that today rules in Russia? It's an important question. It's an important question, particularly keep in mind what Marcello was saying before about the fact that the left, Marxism, reads the dynamic of wars with economic categories. So Russia initiated this war. What is the relationship between this decision, let's put it so, and the peculiar capitalist formation in Russia? Many people, particularly in Eastern Europe, speak of a Russian imperialism. I will not discuss this notion, but I think it is important to come to grips with the whole set of questions to which this notion refers. Then two questions on internationalism. I'm happy to take them. I was kind of intrigued by the reference to multiple powers. I think it's an important point, meaning that, to put it again quickly for want of time, in our efforts to reimagine, reinvent internationalism, we have to be aware of the deep heterogeneity of the global space. This is, in a way, what I had in mind when I was saying that internationalism today cannot take the nation as its constitutive unit, as it was the case in historical forms of internationalism. And the question of decolonization is also crucial. I think that the legacy of anti-colonial struggles must be one of the driving forces behind this attempt to reinvent internationalism. I think we have to look in a detailed way at movements behind the kind of widespread, I wouldn't say indifference, but widespread behavior not to join the West in the current war. I think this is a very, very important point. I mean, also regarding India, I would like to have more time to discuss about that. And to conclude, allow me to pick up on one of the questions asked by John Dunn. The question regarding the meaning of stopping the war. The meaning of stopping the war in a situation in which, on the one hand, you have the possibility of a military defeat of Russia, and on the other hand, you have the possibility of the destruction of Ukraine. Sure, this is the situation nowadays, I mean, and we have to do everything possible to change this situation. There must be pressure. There must be forums within which a kind of compromise become possible. In a war, a compromise is always a compromise between enemies. Which is the alternative to the compromise? You know, if you listen to the words of President Zelensky, but also of President Joe Biden, it seems that the only option is the military victory of Ukraine. I'm not an expert in military affairs, but from what I read, it seems to me that such a victory can also be possible, but after years of war. After years of war. After a kind of occupation of vast parts of Ukraine, similar to the occupation of vast parts of Afghanistan. Then you can have a kind of prolonged war of resistance, and maybe Ukraine could win, but which would be the price of such a victory? This is the reason why I think that there is no alternative to a politics that attempts to stop the war with any means necessary. I know that this is not easy. I know that, let's say, quote and unquote, our forces are not particularly powerful, but we have to do everything we can do in order to change the situation in which the alternative that you describe in your question is the only alternative.
Thank you so much, Sandro. I will now go to Professor Shamadar. Most of the questions have been addressed to him. I will just have one more question because it's from one of the students. And I know he's particularly caring about students asking questions. And this question is, can we say that Western liberal democracies try to establish neo-Nazi and ultra-nationalist and bring them to mainstream politics in the name of countering Russian civilization? And I would also want you to reflect on some of the questions on women's rape, because we come from a country where women have been habitually raped by men on both sides. Women's wombs were cut off and unborn babies were taken about, and the world did not shed tears. I am not saying they should not shed tears now for the cause of women. Everywhere, women is used for the masculinist project of nation and nationalism. So I would also like Professor Shamadar and also Professor Mustab to reflect a little bit on it. First, Professor Shamadar.
Paula, can you kindly repeat the first question? I mean, of the two questions in the last round that you mentioned, the first one.
First question is by a student who asked whether the Western liberal democracies are actually, in the name of contradicting Russia, bringing up neo-nationalists and neo-Nazis and ultra-nationalists.
Thank you. I shall begin with this last question of the student and then go to the other question, but I shall mainly frame my responses around two things: what I think can be a possible peace politics and main slogans today, and the question of globalization, which is on border, Europe, everything is very crucial. I shall preface my response with the observation again that peace politics on one hand can be based on eternal, let us say, classical principles of socialism, of communism, of working class politics, etc. But on the other hand, it has to take into consideration each concrete situation of war and make concrete analysis and advance peace politics today. And the particular nature of war would be important in turning peace politics to become, or in making peace politics a part of politics of social transformation. So that's very important, and that I want to, repeat while beginning my responses. The question of globalization is important because I think that the reality of globalization will be starker, by which I mean the reality of its uneven nature, its multiple competing and collaborative forms, centers, and consequences. And in a way, it is good, because we had become accustomed to treating globalization in a very centralist model. There was only one world. But if that model is on its way out due to this war, perhaps sooner than later, or sooner than we anticipated, there is no reason to be dismayed at that. And surely the Euro-American model of globalization is over. Nations, peoples, countries, they will claim their right to globalize in their own ways. And this is where, again, it's not the primacy of economics every time. Even the economics is also, as I said, very, very, in disparate forms. So they will claim the right to globalize in their own way. Legal pluralism, currency pluralism, pluralism of trade regime, all these will soon require a global dialogue order. Perhaps this will be a kind of daily dialogue because we are so much used to this order maintained by the dollar-euro link, much in the style of the daily plebiscite of the ancient time. The sanctions regime brings out the harsher, coercive face of globalization as we find today. But precisely these coercive face will also hasten the way to multiple currency regimes. And in that sense, we cannot separate, again, the global strategy of containing Russia and China by the Euro-American military alliance and the military coterie from the way they wanted to run globalization. So that is my first point, and I welcome therefore the poser by the particular member of the audience who raised the question of containing Russia. And as I can only repeat, a concrete analysis of a concrete situation is absolutely important in framing peace politics. This is a war in the neoliberal time. While there will be continuity with war and peace politics in the liberal time, but I can only repeat that we must understand the new aspects of the wars of our time. What will be the key steps for a peace politics? And again, to make clear, because there have been certain ideologically loaded questions, some of the things that I didn't anticipate or didn't say, but members of the audience thought that I had wanted to say all those. There is no question for peace activists to say that rape of women is justifiable or one has to remain silent on that. There is no question where peace activists will decry all the acts that have been outlawed by the Geneva Conventions. But on the other hand, I will reserve my right to dispute ideologically formulated questions where you term someone as aggressor, you term another as innocent victim. I will not go into quarrel on that. All I can say is that in my main presentation, I have already said that for peace activists, context is as important as the question, who threw the first stone? People in India, we are habituated. From our student age, we have been battling the forces of communal riots, the forces of communal discord. And we know this very, how would you put it, banal question of the time, who threw the first stone? Who first attacked the mosque? Or who first attacked the marriage procession of the Hindus? Who threw the first stone syndrome is something that peace activists to be aware of. So if Lenin had gone by that road, then clearly even in First World War, there was an aggressor. But that's not the way in which peace activists define aggression or define their peace politics. Peace activists, the terms that they set are different. Their framework is different from the terms and from the framework of the warmongering parties. We cannot imbue the framework of the war parties. So what can be the key steps? Not many, but clearly important, and I take the cue from Sandro, but where I shall say is that if you think of the left forces during the Zimmer world, except the German parties, let us say the Bolsheviks and many others, they were minuscule. They were not strong. They became strong precisely by pursuing the right policy to cope with war. War presents unprecedented opportunity for critical politics or left politics to reshape, reorient their transformative strategies for society. The key steps would be one, that the US, NATO allies and Ukraine will make clear that NATO will not enlarge into Ukraine or any other state on the eastern side of Europe, period. Getting that promise, immediately Russia will stop the war and leave Ukraine. At the same time, peace activists must raise a much more strategic demand, disband NATO and outlaw global military alliances. China didn't enter, even in the heydays of the old socialism, any military alliance with any country. In the great Afro-Asian world or Latin American world, you don't find the multilateral military alliances. NATO is an oddity in today's world. Peace activists must demand that NATO and global military alliances must be outlawed and they must rally behind the UN collective security arrangement. If that is insufficient, and clearly that is insufficient, because UN has been bypassed again and again by warmongers. Recall the coalition of the willing of Junior Bush, etc., including expansion of NATO. Fourth, territorial integrity of countries is paramount, and democratic transformation would mean denazification and decoupling from neoliberalism. I know many peace activists and radical liberal, people in Europe think Europe has been denazified. I do think that the rat lines, the story is not over. I think an enormous supportive material can be presented if really there were to be one day a tribunal on that, how nationalists in Eastern Europe colluded with the later generation Nazis in making these countries the extremely, how would you call it? I do not know. I'm at loss to find out the correct English word, but the kind of, how would I put it, frenzied nationalism that we get from the countries, partly because there is an alliance between the nationalists and the later generation Nazis. That must be very clearly combated. All this would mean, finally, we oppose militarism of all kinds. That means, again, we have to claim back their heritage of non-alignment in today's context. It can be done only when we have brought back the question of reconciliation, which was there brought in by radicals in the beginning of the 90s in the context of the ethnic wars. And Paula knows, many other friends know that when I wrote The Politics of Dialogue, I framed the principles of minimal justice, which was taken up, fortunately, or to the great cause of the peace activists, by many peace activists. What would be the principles of minimal justice? We all know what maximal justice would be. But what will be the basis of the dialogic justice? On basis of, or on the taking that as framework, we can advance a politics of reconciliation. I do not think, without fighting for reconciliation between Ukraine and Russia, without arguing for reconciliation between Russia and the post-Soviet Europe, we can have peace. What is the concrete root of militarism today? I do not think by avoiding that, million-dollar question, we can work for peace. It has to be a concrete investigation of the concrete time. And in that context, we have to formulate the principles of dialogic justice and the cause of peace and reconciliation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Now I will come to Professor Musto for his deliberations. And there are a few questions from the students on, the effect of Ukraine war on Emmanuel Macron's elections. So if you feel like taking it up, please do take it up, and you could take up any of the questions that have been deliberated or not. So over to you, sir.
Thanks. I have 3 minutes left, so I will try to be as short as possible. The first question...
No, you can take more than 3 minutes. We will carry on.
Thanks. The first question is about wars of aggression. I believe that they are possible to recognize, and I wanted to clarify that a non-alignment policy does not always mean neutrality. It's not a policy of neutrality or not recognizing the main responsibility, in this case of Russia, or ignoring the international right. I will try to respond like I did in my presentation, using examples of the past. And I want to connect the things that Ranabir just mentioned with this debate that was, that arose around the New Army, a book that Jean Jaurès, the most important socialist at the beginning of the 20th century, published in 1911, a debate about the distinction between offensive and defensive war and the attitude that the left should take in response to the latter, including the cases where a country independence was threatened, right? So in this case, we can act, he said, we can intervene. There could be this support to war. I believe that the response that Rosa Luxemburg gave to this idea in a review of the book that she published the year after was very interesting. Luxemburg wrote that historical phenomena such as modern wars cannot be measured with the yardstick of justice, cannot be understood with the word of justice or through a paper schema of defense and aggression. So according to Rosa Luxemburg, there is a difficulty sometimes to establish whether a war was really offensive or defensive, or whether the state that started the war did it deliberately or just as a stratagems adopted by that country to create a bigger attack from the other one. The point here is how to avoid the escalation. And this is also connected with the question raised by Paula about women and about the fact that the struggle against militarism, as I try to say, was a core of the struggle against patriarchy. This became a distinctive part, for example, of the International Women's Day, and historically, struggles of feminist movement opposed war, budget, and also any new conflicts that featured prominently in many platforms of the international feminist movement that featured this idea of supporting the war. Now, the question of not condemning the war. Not condemning the war is a mistake. I mentioned this not only for the less of credibility for future conflict, but also, as Rana Bir said at the very beginning of his presentation, if we do so, if we apply this theory of just war, then peace politics, I'm reading from the notes that I took from his intervention, peace politics is narrow or even impossible. So we cannot say that since the enemy of my enemy did the same, right, then we should turn toward another side, right? So since my enemy, United States, is doing similar things or have done the same things, then we should not have a clear condemn and opposition to this. I believe that this would be a strong mistake, and I hope I made it in 4 minutes, Paula.
Thank you so much. You've invoked Chanakya, my enemy of my enemy is my friend, which is something that our students know very well, this strain of a thought. So thank you very much. I think this has been a very exciting debate that we've had today. I would request to all the speakers, I know this is totally off the cuff, you can refuse, but as the editor of Refugee Watch, I would like to bring out this debate in our next issue of Refugee Watch. So if you can, in a month or two, give me short notes. I know you've all given us short notes. If you can just expand on the basis of your presentation today, then we will bring out this. I think this is a world-class debate that we had over the question of peace. And, it'll be fantastic for our readers in South Asia to contemplate, doing a roundtable for our Refugee Watch in the next couple of months. So thank you very much. We've had multiple sides to peace questions, but I think this has been a clarion call to look at the question of peace from a different perspective. We have had three probably most influential critical thinkers of the present times here today together debating on the critical question of how to make peace without, and all of them spoke about we cannot think of peace without having a reformulation, a radical reformulation of how we look at war, questions of war, whether from the perspective of the root causes or whether from the perspective of ideology or from the perspective of not looking at it as binaries of aggressor and liberators. So thank you very much, all of you. This has been a fantastic debate, and like any successful deliberations, this has left us with many more questions rather than answers. We were not seeking answers, we were trying to bring out the questions, and you have, all three of you, very successfully brought out the questions. Thank you very much, and thank you to all the participants for actively participating in this debate. There are a number of other participants who were probably itching to participate like me, but we have gone way beyond 2 hours, so now we have to close. But this is not the end of it. We will keep coming back to these questions, most importantly, for existential reasons. Thank you again, and hope to see you very soon again in the near future. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Bye. Bye, Ranabir. Bye, Sandro. Thank you, Paula.
Bye.
Ciao.
Ciao.
And I see you soon, Ranabir.
Yes, sure. Everything is done. The table will be laid out.